GTA The Trilogy Definitive Edition is a project that, by all means, should have been great on paper. Partially remaking 3 of the most beloved open-world video games of the early 2000s for modern platforms, including Nintendo's portable console, seems like an easy success, especially considering that these games have been remastered before. Yet somehow this trilogy launched in a bizarre, buggy, and unoptimized state that I just can't understand what went wrong with it. While normally I would break these up into categories like story, gameplay to review on an individual basis, because these are 3 gigantic open worlds let alone classics that most people have probably played by now, I'll be focusing on the changes with these remasters and remakes and how that plays juxtaposed to the originals. The TLDR with this collection is that the GTA Trilogy Definitive Edition is a buggy, unoptimized mess with a new coat of paint over it that at times looks better, while other times it looks like a mess. I played my review copies on Nintendo Switch OLED Edition and Xbox Series X, so in terms of console performance, I was able to test the high-end performance as well as the low end of the spectrum. With these 3 games, we get some genuinely nice to see visual improvements and quality of life improvements that make visiting these older titles a bit more bearable. The weapon wheel from the later games finds its way in all 3 of these games, letting you quickly have access to all of your weapons. The controls have been updated to match GTA 5 more closely, although because these games have older and different mechanics, it's not a one-to-one translation. The aim mechanics of the originals, for example, used a lock-on mechanic that made firing clumsy and clunky. The new controls let you sort of free aim or adjust your aim alongside the lock-on feature that's better than the originals, but definitely not on par with GTA 5. The minimap also sees some new additions like a waypoint system that lets you better track missions and points of interest. All of these improvements, though much appreciated, feel like minor upgrades once you begin to play these remasters. The biggest upgrades are of course the visual upgrades. While these games aren't technically remakes, they do offer new visuals and improvements that do make these games visually look somewhat like remakes. Sadly, a lot of these visual upgrades seem to have been made through some sort of AI upscaler that unfortunately just doesn't do these games justice. That's where a lot of the issues with these remasters begin. GTA 3 is the oldest in the collection, and it also appears to be the roughest of the 3 in regards to updates and performance. While it takes on the quality of life improvements that the rest of the collection gets, it feels so out of place when it comes to the visual upgrades. Playing on Nintendo Switch, and this goes for pretty much the rest of the games as well, performance was rough, often hitting 20 frames per second along with a stuttering issue that made driving feel terrible. The handling of cars felt completely off, making it quite unplayable when most of the missions require you to drive around from mission to mission, let alone just to explore the open world. On next-gen platforms, that gets improved with the option to play in either fidelity mode or performance mode, with one prioritizing resolution and the other on frame rate. Oddly enough, the performance mode doesn't seem to keep the game locked at 60 frames per second. Now don't get me wrong, it does for the most part hit its target, but there are dips into the mid-40s to low 50s at times that honestly just feel inexcusable on simplified remasters like this on powerful hardware. There's a lot of overlooked bugs in general, from misplaced textures, floating character models, invisible models, and whatever this rain effect is. The way the rain is added to scenes in GTA 3 is via a filter that overlooks the entire screen, but in a layer that makes anything in water unaffected by the rain. It looks terrible and makes seeing anything virtually impossible while raining. Again, a lot of this seems to be done by a blanket upscaler that doesn't get checked by QA for issues. Sure, the lighting and the character models look better for the most part, despite some very odd looking NPCs from time to time, but overall this title simply just didn't get the attention it deserved. GTA Vice City is one of the better upgrades in this collection. The vibrant 80s inspired color palette and art style truly does take advantage of the new visual upgrade. Lighting, neon signs, and sunlight specifically, look fantastic in this more vibrant looking open world. Sure, there are still a few odd character models here and there, but for the most part, Vice City does look fantastic with this facelift. Unfortunately, like GTA 3 before it, it continues to suffer from input lag, the occasional frame rate dip, and various other visual bugs like this floating character and motorcycle. You can for sure have more fun with this title than you can with the other version of GTA 3, but it does suffer from similar issues. Like GTA 3 before it, it struggles so much on the Nintendo Switch to the point that it's hard to control at times, but it is more playable but in a flawed state on next gen. GTA San Andreas feels like the most impressive inclusion in this selection, and that's no doubt in part to it being the newest game in the collection. San Andreas by default had a more enriched feature set like customizable characters that made GTA feel like a more personable experience than 3 and Vice City before it. The visual upgrade here looks solid, CJ's character model looks improved for the most part, albeit with some janky looking moments like his eyes in this scene. That sort of continues to be the trend with this last title. Gameplay wise, it's a much better game than the first 2, but because the visual upgrades don't seem to be tailored on a game by game basis, there are various performance and visual bugs here too. On my Xbox Series X, for example, the skybox and tree elements just look bad. There were a ton of artifacts and flickering that kept distracting me while trying to drive around town. While the frame rate hiccups weren't as bad in this title, at least on next-gen titles, Nintendo Switch continues to chug along with the frame rate that occasionally stutters, thus making it very hard to drive around town. All in all, the GTA Trilogy Definitive Edition, on paper, is a great idea. In practice, it's executed with sadly some lazy upscaling that was outsourced by third-party developers, and the lack of effort and attention to detail is ever present in this collection. It's one thing to release a half-baked product, but it's another to take down the previously pretty solid one, and then replace it with a broken one at the full price $60 collection that is barely in working order at times, especially on PC where they straight up took down the game launcher. On Nintendo Switch, I'd avoid this title as playing in dock mode is simply a bad experience with a ton of frame rate dips and a bad draw distance that occasionally makes you crash into cars that weren't there previously. It does admittedly get better in handheld mode, but not to the quality standard that I think is worth that $60 price tag. Next gen consoles get a better experience, but not to the extent that you should expect from these brand new $500 consoles. The last gen consoles also offer a mid-tier experience, as the 60fps mode on PS4 Pro at times even hits 30 frames per second. I don't doubt that this collection can get patched up and worked on to truly hit the high standard for the series. I just don't think it'll happen anytime soon, and for how these games are operating at the moment, I recommend waiting and seeing if this eventually gets fixed, as it looks like it might just be another Cyberpunk 2077 situation.